Hey everybody, and welcome back. On this video, I'm going to be building a diorama based on a monthly collaboration that I take part in with some fellow YouTubers. Those content creators who are participating can all be found right here. Here's their icons, but you'll also see links to their channels down below in the description, and I urge you to check them out. They've all done phenomenal jobs building these projects, and some of them bring some very unique skills to the table, so definitely worth your time. Please check them out. So the theme of this collaboration is to basically build a diorama and paint one miniature based on a theme that a randomly assigned partner has given you. My partner, patchworkEm, whose icon is here, and also her channel can be found in the description down below, I gave her the challenge of painting synthwave themes. So she had to take one miniature and build a world around it in a diorama that represents the synthwave theme. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's basically a very retro 80s style, cyberpunk looking world with a lot of pinks, blues, and pastel colors with a very limited color palette. I had the privilege of seeing her video before it went live because she showed it off to me as a spoiler, and oh wow, she knocked it out of the park, so I hope I can do her theme justice. In return, the theme that she gave me was, I'm a Barbie girl in a 40K world. So I never really grew up playing with Barbies. However, I did have sisters, so I do have sisters. So I'm very familiar with the Barbie aesthetic and that 80s style, which is definitely, 80s is definitely my kind of world. And 40K I never really played, actually. To be honest, I've never played 40K. I've played Age of Sigmar, I've painted numerous models. However, I'm very familiar with the world because I've done several commissions and painting projects around 40K. So I thought this was going to be a really cool challenge. The first thing I needed to do was to pick a model that represented the 40K world that I thought I could do justice as a Barbie theme. So what I did is I actually picked up Jane Czar, this miniature right here, and I feel like she has all the right characteristics to pull off a very cool looking Barbie theme, and she's definitely living in a 40K world. So this is also my first diorama I've ever built, and a couple of interesting things about dioramas versus just tabletop terrain. Tabletop terrain is very generic in a sense, and that's not a bad thing. You're building an entire world out in front of you. It has to have lots and lots of different focal points to keep people's attention. Dioramas, on the other hand, focus on one or two individual points of focus that tells a story. So I basically have to combine my love of building terrain with my love of painting and have it dive into a single focal point to hopefully do this theme justice. So let's see how I did. Let me know how I did down in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your opinions on this. And yeah, let's dive in right here after the break. Alright, so jumping right in, I've already pre-built and primed Jane Czar to be painted. And the first thing we're going to do here is start painting the flesh tones. Now for the sake of this video, I'm going to just kind of breeze through painting a lot of these. I'm not going to show you how I've painted flesh. However, if you check out my last video, I do show how I paint all of my flesh tones. That said, all the recipes will be down in the bottom left-hand corner as I get to each phase, just to show you what sort of paints that I used. Now, this is a bit of a long process too, because I always want to start with the flesh and paint outwards away from the model. I'm starting with the mahogany brown and just painting up the flesh, and I'm going to do random mixes of about 1-to-1 of each color and a little bit of water as I go, because I want a nice thin, smooth consistency, and I want the flesh to have a good, clean blend to it. This process is something that I highly recommend everybody out there sort of practice and get used to doing those nice smooth transitions between your darker undertones to your upper highlights. As you can see here, what I'm continuing to do is bring up all of the highlights as I go. I constantly turn the model, and hopefully I'm keeping this all in frame for everybody, but I want to continuously bring up the highlights closer toward the chest and the top of the muscles and the corners to give it a much more realistic look to the flesh. The next thing we're going to do here is dive into the hair, and this model has a lot of hair. So I've got a pretty simple recipe that I use for blonde hair. Blonde is always a very difficult color to work with, as is like white and gray hair a lot of the time. So what I'm doing is I'm putting down a base layer of Xandri dust, and I'm going to go over this with Averland Sunset, and this is going to give me a relatively dark-ish looking yellow when it's all said and done. However, this is all just what I would consider part of the base coats and starting to bring up the highlights. I'm going to use a little bit of Seraphim Sepia on the tops to darken up all those little recessed areas and create additional contrast. For the highlights, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use Sunny Flesh Tone, and that's going to be the brightest element near the top of the hair, and it's going to add that more blonde appearance to it. Something to mention here is I'm also adding white to the tip of the tail, where I'm going to have a transition to a blue and a pink to give it that real Barbie looking aesthetic. It's much easier to paint blue over white than it is yellow, because obviously when you mix those two colors you're going to get green. So to minimize that effect when you're not using an airbrush and you're brushing it on, you can put down a base layer of white and you'll maintain that nice bright blue color. I'm bringing up that highlight on the hair even more now as I take my sunny skin tones here and just kind of bring everything up to what I would consider a nice blonde or platinum blonde-ish looking hair. Mixing in a little bit of white to it adds that increased level of highlight that I'm going to do near the tips and the very top of the hair, and the bend as it bends around the back and catches that light. I want that to represent fairly, so I add a little bit more highlight to that element as well. For the tips of the hair, what I wanted to do is I wanted to transition from blonde to blue to pink, because if memory serves me right, in a lot of those commercials, pink and blues are very popular colors in the Barbie world, and she always seemed to have a lot of highlights in her hair. So I want to replicate that with this model because she has so much hair. I think it would be a nice look to it. So what I'm going to do is have it transition down from blonde to blue, and then I want the tip of that little ponytail that she has to be a bright pink color, going all the way up to some white dots for extreme highlights. This was actually a little bit more challenging than I originally expected because, again, even though I put down that white base layer down below it, there's still blending that needs to be done, and that blend had to be done between a little bit of yellow and some of the blue. So I had to go over this many times just to make sure there wasn't a very obvious green transition going from the blonde to the blue. Now, in the real world, a lot of times this actually does happen when women dye their hair. And they have blonde hair, it ends up being a little bit green. However, this being a model, we can mostly work around that and try to transition it evenly. Then for the very tip, like I mentioned, we're putting on this bright pink. We want to transition and just blend and feather it in as best we can to make sure there's a nice clean transition going from that blonde down to the pink. And I think it came out pretty good looking. As far as I can tell with my own eyes, it looks all right. The transition looks pretty nice, it's smooth, and it comes together looking fairly Barbie-esque. Going on to the armor here. The armor is a pretty simple combination of colors. I'm primarily just using black, white, and a light blue. I'm using the black to change the color a little bit and darken it up, neutralize it a bit, so I can use that as an undertone, and then I'm going all the way up and mixing with the white for the highlights. Now, I'm trying to do this in a non-metallic metal type of fashion. I've never done non-metallic metal before on super bright colors like pastel blues and pinks. This is definitely a new experience for me, but I think it's coming out all right. And when you see the final product, hopefully you'll agree that it's not too badly done. One thing I'll mention here is, again, for the sake of the speed of painting the Mini and building the diorama, there are other smaller elements that I've painted here, like these ribbons that you see off of the weapon that are a mixture of pink and blue, creating a transition to a purplish color. I just decided to mix in a couple of colors and thought it would look good for the flare, but there's no real need to show you the tutorial for that because it's pink and blue, and I just painted up the ribbons and made them look as nice as I could. The final step of the blue armor is to mix in a fair amount of white, and I really want to bring everything to a nice highlight level. So I'm mixing a little bit of blue with my white to bring it up to that fine brightness point, and eventually it'll just be small pock marks of white paint, very opaque white paint, to really emphasize a shine or a glint on the armor. I decided to do pink on some of the other armor because, again, I don't want it to just be blonde and blue. Barbie is always very well known for that hot pink aesthetic, so I want to make her mask and part of her weapon and her boots in that pink aesthetic as well. So I am taking game color Warlord Purple, mixing it with squid ink and some white, and I am using the Warlord Purple as the undertone and bringing everything up from darkest to brightest on all of the armor. Again, kind of trying a non-metallic metal approach. Ultimately, I'm not sure it really sells that effect. However, I was pretty happy with the final results, and it looked bright, it looked very Barbie, and I think it came out pretty good. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just doing a couple layers of the Warlord Purple undertone before I start bringing up everything using squid ink to a highlighted point, and then all of my highest points are going to end up, again, just like the blue, with that dead white color, very bright point at the end. And you can see here that she's actually coming along really nicely. I gave her skin a very tanned Barbie looking plasticky look to it. The original model, I believe it's some sort of plate armor that looks kind of white or biomechanical of some nature, but I felt like obviously she needs the Barbie aesthetic, so I painted her up in a flesh tone for her armor to sell the Barbie look even more. And I think it's really coming along with the blues and the pinks, and it's definitely working with her blonde hair. So one of the things that I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump ahead to the highlighting and small details. A couple of the things that I'm going to do are very basic things. I'm going to bring up some of the gems, because they're little tiny gems that are like on her helmet, on her chest, on her wrists, that I'm going to quickly paint up, and then I'm going to provide small white dot highlighting, and of course basic non-metallic metal, using only 3 colors. I'm actually only using black, white, and a little bit of that bright blue. Not the best blue to use for non-metallic metal, but I think it'll work out pretty nicely. So take a look. Here she is. This is the final model when she's all done and all of her highlights are done. I added some small white dots to the hair just to emphasize certain points, and obviously pink on the ponytail holder band thing. And I think she came out pretty good. So now that I have her done, the next step here is to start constructing the diorama. So I've 3D printed these little barrels here, and these barrels are actually really nice. They printed up really quickly, and I had some holes dug into them using the software just so I can insert a small LED into one of them. Now, to do this, you can use all sorts of different tactics. You can use a small battery, a coin battery holder, some wire, some solder, but I'm going to use this little tea light here because that's a pretty common and easy way to do it. Now I'm going to cover my tea light in some DOS air putty, and it's going to be hidden, and I'm going to dig in and bury all of my barrels so that I'm essentially making a small little tiny terrain piece that this is going to fit on my overall diorama. This doesn't take too long to do. You just kind of add in putty where you need to, and then let it sit out overnight so it hardens. Now, one thing I will say is it does take a little while to harden. Your barrels or pieces may not adhere directly into the putty because of, shrinking, expanding, etc. So you can glue it when it's all said and done. Now here's my diorama piece, and unfortunately my camera didn't record some of the parts where I was cutting things out and assembling, but it's a pretty basic process. What I did here is I just took a bunch of chits and things that I had laying around. I had some molds already pre-made for the stonework, and all this is basically plaster of Paris and some stone molds that I got from Woodland Scenics. My barrels, which you can see here, and this dusty looking material is essentially a terrarium component for the bedding for, like, you know, if you own iguanas or lizards and frogs and that sort of thing. You can pick it up at any pet supply store or order it on Amazon. I'll make sure the link is down below. This stuff works out really great because it comes in these big blocks and you can just break it off and sprinkle it over Mod Podge or glue, and then spray it down really well with some PVA spray so it hardens up like a rock, and then you can prime it and dry brush it. It comes out very nicely. So I'm going to begin airbrushing as the next step, and what I'm doing here is taking just a dark brown color. I believe I used Doom Bull brown, and I am just trying to maintain the paint on the barrels, trying to keep it off of the primed black ground. You can always go back and add a little bit of extra black paint, primer or whatever around the barrels to clean it up, as I actually ended up doing. But I'm painting the barrels brown to give it a more rust undertone effect. And then I'm going to bring it up in highlight with a light blue. I used Lothern blue followed by a verdigris color. This is actually an improved trick upon how I used to paint my weathered barrels, courtesy of Angel Heraldez. You can check him out on Instagram. He's an incredible painter, and he has some incredible tutorials and guides, so definitely check him out. And then, of course, I'm going to weather it down. And the easiest way to do that is to just wet my brush and start scraping it across the model to rip off layers of paint to the undertone to show that it's been damaged and weathered over time. Lastly, I'm going to add some easy weathering effects through pigments. I'm just going to add some mixture of pigments on top of this and blend them in. Once the barrels are done, the next step here is to go ahead and start dry brushing with a white color or an off-white color. I didn't want there to be too many colors on my diorama because, again, the main focus here is to have my miniature in the middle be the focal point, with a little bit of background using these colorful barrels. So what I've done is I just aggressively dry brush white all over the model, and as you can see, it picks out all the detail of that scatter coconut dust that we've put on at the bottom, very, very nicely, giving it a lot of texture. The next thing we're going to do is add a little bit more life to these barrels over here. I'm going to mix a little bit of Uhu and some lively green through Game Color just to give it some slime effect. You can do this with a resin, but I didn't have any resin on hand at the moment, and Uhu dries pretty hard when it's all done and when you clump it up the way I'm doing it here. The last place I'm going to use the airbrush here is on the base. I want the area where my model is standing to look bright, and I want it to really stand out and pop. So I'm going to take some of my purple colors again, and I'm just going to airbrush down a dark layer first and then bring it up to a highlight to the center before I place down my pinned model. Lastly, for the barrels, I'm going to take a little cotton ball here and just fluff it out a little bit, break off a piece, and then I'm going to spray a little bit of black primer on it and Mod Podge it down over the top of the hole where my LED is. Lastly, and most importantly, no Barbie is complete without a shopping bag in her hand, because she just came back from the Emperor's Regional Mall and she has some goodies with her. So let's go ahead and place that, and boom, you've got yourself a nice Barbie-esque looking miniature. And here we are with the final product. I think it actually came out pretty good looking. The Barbie color, I wanted her to have the most vibrant colors to draw people's eye directly to the model. The barrels in the background provide a nice background subject, so everything's not just black and white outside of the Barbie model. And of course the airbrush on the ground was a nice little touch that I think worked out better than I anticipated it to. But overall, I hope this sells the appeal of this is a 40K world where everything's destroyed and very apocalyptic looking and almost has that kill team feel to it. But at the same time, I hope Stay Z, as I have named her, definitely sells you on that Barbie aesthetic as well. This was a really fun challenge to take part in. I really enjoyed it. I've never built a diorama before, so hopefully this one came out pretty good. So thank you guys again so much. I had a lot of fun with this one, and catch you in the next video.